Thank you again for joining the SCV Chamber's COVID-19 Resource Webinar Series. This is the 6th in our series. I'm Peter Warda with the SCV Chamber and will be hosting today's webinar. In addition to the Chamber's webinar series, the Chamber has a comprehensive COVID-19 resource page, which is constantly updated. Please go to scvchamber.com and click on the COVID-19 menu item. You can find details on HR compliance, unemployment benefits, and business disaster financing options, among many other vital resources. Please visit our events page to view and register for our upcoming webinars. As we begin our program, we want to thank our presenter, Mark Griffiths, with Newleaf Training and Development for helping put together today's important Chamber webinar. Today's webinar will discuss benefits of remote working, best practice in relation to facilitating virtual meetings, and understand ways to engage a virtual workforce, to list a few. Newleaf Training and Development is a staff training and leadership development company based here in Valencia on Turney Road, and they started business over 14 years ago. They serve clients all over the world and many of the larger SCV-based businesses here in town. 3 years ago, they opened up a second office in Orlando, Florida. Our presenter today, Mark Griffiths, opened that office, and so please join me in welcoming Mark live from Orlando. Mark?
Hello, thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
You're good to go.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, spending the next 45 minutes or so with you, covering what is a very important topical subject, particularly in light of the current pandemic, which is in fact changing how we work, where we work, and how we engage our workforce. Not just for the short term, but in our opinion here at Newleaf Training Development, forevermore. Even after this crisis is under control, and I think it's important to say it will pass. It may not seem like it, we're in the thick of it at the moment, but it will pass. More and more organizations will see the benefits of allowing employees or contractors to work remotely, and the workplace will have far greater expectations to continue to experience this flexibility. Yes, being housebound and having limited options in terms of exercise, entertainment and socializing is a big barrier. However, more and more from our experience, after working with hundreds of very notable organizations worldwide in 2020, with so many low-cost technology options available, bridging that digital divide and offering remote working really is getting easier and easier, with all stakeholders beginning to see the benefits in doing so. But what the situation has done is allowed organizations who maybe have avoided this concept, maybe being critical of this way of working, or maybe it's just fallen down their to-do list. It's really forced them to fast track this process, find solutions, and in many cases, experience some of the pain sooner rather than they would really have realized. I'm sure if I open this platform up to each attendee today, and it's great to see so many of you have joined the webinar today, there's going to be a range of experiences over the last few weeks. Good, great, excellent, maybe game-changing, or maybe terrible, as we do appreciate for some organizations, working this way does put them at a real disadvantage. For example, hospitality is reeling at the moment, as it's an industry, at least in 2020, that relies on people and groups and activities and, in general, an in-person approach. Now, in relation to our topic today, simply saying working remotely is one thing. Utilizing Zoom, which is obviously extremely popular at the moment, adding a green screen background, which I'm sure many of you have been on a Zoom call where people have had some weird and quite strange at times Zoom green screen backgrounds. That's one thing. But actually continuing business operations efficiently, ensuring the workforce is engaged and as productive as we can make them, I'm sure we'd all agree is something else entirely. And it's that concept that we're going to be exploring during our time together. One further important note in relation to your expectations for this session is we are presenting this subject from the perspective as a business owner or senior leader within an organization. Everyone on this call have very different challenges at the moment leading this change, particularly under such extreme circumstances, compared to maybe someone who's just been directed to work from home. Now, we're not undermining their challenges. As we'll hear on this webinar, change is hard for everyone. However, for many people on this call, myself included, we're business owners or we're senior leaders with a far greater level of accountability. And when it all passes, and again, it will pass, we do need to make sure we take the very best of the last few weeks, complement that with where we were previously and where we're heading next, strategically knitting everything together. So with that, let's begin. Thank you once again for my earlier introduction. I just want to add my contact details on screen. If anybody has any questions at the end of the session that they don't get the opportunity to ask, maybe you'd like a copy of the slides or some important information we'll be sharing, you may want to refer back to either on the webinar recording or the actual slide deck itself. I'm more than happy to share that with you. If we can be of service, or if you'd just like to connect, please feel free to reach out on social media, on email, or you can call the East Coast office direct. I'm also going to share these at the end of the webinar. Okay, so just a few words to summarize our organization and to provide some additional context. Newleaf Training and Development provide customized training solutions, and that incorporates a range of things, including e-learning development, instructional design, leadership and management seminars, coaching, keynotes, and personality assessments. And we categorize these under our four main delivery channels, which you can see on screen: seminars, keynotes, coaching, and online. We're established in 2006. We do have an office here. I'm broadcasting from today on the East Coast in Orlando. Nice and sunny, 88 degrees, 89 degrees actually, just checking on my watch. And we have a second office over where you are in Santa Clarita. To be clear, I oversee the East Coast, and Paul Butler, as I'm sure many of you know on the webinar today, oversees the West Coast office. And very simply, our mission is to help people and organizations be their best. Now, these objectives, which we're sharing on screen, were shared on the meeting invite and on the Chamber website. But just to serve as a very brief reminder to cover why we're here today, let's just run back through these. But before I do that, just as a reminder, this isn't meant to be a reactive presentation, but actually a proactive one. Now, I don't want the message today to be, well, this is something we just have to get through. Next few weeks will pass, we'll get back to normal. As a quick reminder, this situation may have forced our hand, but regardless of the coronavirus, remote working has several benefits that we are going to be exploring. We're actually going to approach three key aspects of remote working: facilitation of meetings, the delivery of ongoing training, and the different platforms and things which exist, and the tools which are available to help you deliver these. But ultimately, at the end of our time together, we'll be looking at engagement and how we ensure our workforce is productive and engaged when working remotely. So why am I here? Mark Griffiths from Newleaf Training and Development. It's a pleasure to be here, but why am I speaking on this subject? Well, my background is displayed on screen, but just to verbalize some of that, although I'm based in Orlando, Florida, and I've lived here for nearly 3.5 years, my wife and 13-year-old daughter, and by the way, we love it in the States. We really wouldn't want to be anywhere else. You probably tell I'm not a native Floridian. I'm actually originally from the UK, and more specifically from Manchester in the Northwest. Any soccer fans on the webinar today? I'm definitely from the red half of Manchester, and Man United fan, not a Blue City fan, I can assure you that. But please do let us know in the chat function, in the question function, if of any fellow Reds on the call today. Now, whilst I was in Salford, I completed a degree in information systems, and in doing so, completed a pretty comprehensive study into remote working. It's therefore a subject I have a real genuine interest in over the last 20 years, the power that technology can bring to organizations when it comes to remote working. Now, 20 years ago, things were obviously very different. Internet access that we take for granted, which can still be a little bit up and down at times. Software, think social media wasn't even a thing 20 years ago, but it still happened. Remote working still happened. Even back then, it was still very effective for particular organizations and organizations in general. But for individuals that had a particular interest in a personality type who really wanted to work this way, it was very successful. After attending that, I went to the University of Manchester. I worked in the education sector then for nearly 10 years in a range of roles. I actually initially started in the classroom and then fast-tracked after only 2.5 years into a senior leadership role. I actually oversaw a range of major statewide education digital transformation change projects. But for that period of time, to be clear, to bring it back to our subject today, it was very structured, scheduled, largely in person, on site. And after a while, that really does institutionalize you. When can I have a bathroom break? When can I eat? When do I stretch my legs? When do I get the opportunity to socialize with colleagues? Just some examples. Over time, it changes you. It changes your behavior. Again, very structured, commuting, same times, lots of travel, lots of on-site meetings, lots of people, children, colleagues, parents, government officials in that particular role. In general, lots of human interactions. After that, I went on to transition into the corporate sector, working for Randstad, which some of you may have heard of, the largest staffing and recruitment organization in the world up until recently, $20 billion turnover. First joined in a business development role for 18 months, then 12 months in an L&D role. So for nearly 2.5 years, it was a remote-based role. What a shock. What a change. Polar opposites, literally one extreme to the other. Almost overnight, my car was my mobile office. My kitchen table, kid you not, was my desk. And I just had a cell phone and laptop to keep me company. For me personally, this is a big change. And to be completely transparent, a very difficult change. Initially, awesome, break from the old routine, less structure. But in fact, my experience almost exactly followed the research I conducted while at university. My productivity and focus to begin was high. However, after just a few weeks, it started to change and things were not as easy as I first imagined. But more on the benefits and challenges with a remote-based role shortly. Since going on to be a business owner here in the US, opening the East Coast office, as I mentioned, 3.5 years ago for Newleaf. And this is a kind of a hybrid role between the two previous experiences, a balance of having an office with people and employees and colleagues. Up until 3 weeks ago, obviously, we've had to change how we work as well. But also with the flexibility, working from home, traveling to an airport, working for Panera with a bagel when required, a mix that now I'm truly extremely happy with. So hopefully that provides my credibility in speaking on this subject. And again, if anyone's had any similar experiences, then we will have time at the end of the webinar to take any questions and maybe even share some stories. Or again, if you don't have the opportunity or time to do so, please do follow up after the webinar. So as we go through the next 30 minutes or so, please do consider the following. Each of you will have opinions on this subject. In fact, you'll have perceptions of remote working and the opportunities and challenges it can bring. Rhetorical question. What was Einstein's definition of insanity? Well, it was doing the same thing and expecting different results. Therefore, today, please do be open-minded as we spend our time together and go through the content. If there's a comment we make, some information that we share, or a question that maybe somebody asks at the end of the presentation, please do stop and think, because our perceptions do drive our behaviors that ultimately impact the results we get in life. And changing our perceptions of a work process or a person can alter how we work with that person or how we approach a particular workflow. And that can significantly change the results we get. You may think, for example, let's just get through the next few weeks, get everybody back in the office, as I prefer to work that way. Now, that may be your preference, and that may be your perception that everyone thinks in the same way, when that really may not be the case. And there's actually a great quote on screen that you can see, which is just on that previous slide, which refers to what an awesome opportunity this is. We'll leave it on there for just a couple of seconds if you didn't get a chance to read that. Thank you, producer. And then we will be moving on. So we're not going to poll how many organizations are currently offering remote working, as we're going to assume for the vast majority of organizations, if not all, that that's most of you on the call today. COVID-19 has forced our hand. It really has. However, we are interested in understanding how many organizations were offering remote working prior to the coronavirus crisis. So you'll be able to see a poll, which we're going to launch. It'd be great if we could see your responses in relation to that poll.
All, at this point, we are going to be launching a poll. You will see it appear on your screen. If you please just take a couple of seconds to answer it, and then we will get back to putting the results up and continuing our presentation.
Thank you for launching a poll. You can see that on the screen. If we leave it open for maybe another 10 seconds, just a simple yes or no. We deliberately didn't have, well, sometimes, depends on the situation, just a strong yes or no.
Perfect. I'll be going ahead and closing the poll now.
Thank you. Interesting. So we'll leave that on just for a couple of seconds. So a third were already offering remote working. Interesting to see that 2/3 were not. Now again, if we assume that the vast majority of organizations in some capacity are now offering remote working, that is quite the change and really emphasizes why we're on the webinar today. Thank you so much for your participation on that poll. And let's take this opportunity to remind ourselves of the mission of the SCV-EDC, which is to live and work in Santa Clarita Valley. Regardless of COVID-19, surely our aim is to reduce traffic, commuting, and the stress that it brings to all of us on this webinar today. Even in Orlando here, it's the same thing with the I-4. If ever been over here to Orlando on vacation, you know how difficult that transport, that stretch can be. So as much as possible, you know, we really want to encourage people to work locally and ideally maybe at home at times as well. So as mentioned earlier, you know, this really is not a new phenomenon. And as business owners or senior leaders in many cases on the webinar today, we did want to remind you that this trend has been growing pre-COVID-19. Take a look at the statistic on the screen. You can see on there, it's already increased 115% in a decade. And that translates to about 3% of the US workforce. I do wonder what that percentage would be today, but I'm sure it will be significantly more because of the crisis that we're currently trying to maneuver through. There's also a great piece of research released each year on remote working by an organization called Buffer, if you weren't aware of that already. The state of remote working canvasses the opinion of employees, contractors, and organizations to get their opinions on this way of working. You can see the most recent survey took place last year, pre-COVID, and had just less than 2,500 respondents. If anybody's interested, I can share this link to anybody if you want to have a deeper dive. We're just going to be sharing a couple of headlines with you this afternoon. Again, it's a pretty extensive report, but some of these, I think there's 4 headlines we'll share. Hopefully, we'll put the webinar into context. And the first one you can see there, 99% of respondents would want to continue to work this way, at least for some of the time, which I'm sure you would agree is a significant number. Now, I mentioned my experiences earlier when working remotely for Randstad for 2.5 years. Although I did struggle at times, I'm very honest in that. I'm an extrovert. I definitely get my energy from being around people. You know, I can't lie, there were definitely significant benefits in working remotely. And continuing the state of the remote working headlines, you can see how people responded in relation to the advantages, flexibility being number one. You know, I do remember personally being able to customize my schedule, which obviously had some serious benefits in relation to the gym, walking the dog, etc. But it is important to say, again, going back to perception behavior results, it really isn't for everyone. We may think it's best working arrangement for us, therefore everyone must think the same way, but as this chart shows, it's just not the case. I personally found the isolation hard, even with virtual meetings like this, particularly after being around people physically for the previous 10 years. The loneliness was hard. Something else I found challenging, which isn't necessarily represented on this chart here, was guilt. Now, although I can't see people on the webinar, those who've experienced remote working in some capacity may have raised their eyebrows or even smiled when I mentioned that. For those who are confused, guilt, Mark, what do you mean? Well, let me quickly explain. Sometimes I found guilt that I wasn't doing enough, or that I had to overcompensate to justify what I was doing. If I missed a call for a genuine reason, maybe a bathroom break or making coffee, I personally found the guilt incredible. What does my manager think I'm doing? I bet you Stuart, which was his name, by the way, must think I'm on Xbox or I'm slacking in some way. And seriously, that guilt can really chip away at you. Other big challenges are illustrated on screen, just to name check a couple. But, number one being unplugging, which again, I can relate to. Although having that flexibility was great, the lines between work and home can become increasingly blurred. As business leaders, these are things we should obviously be aware of for our employees who are currently experiencing this way of working, maybe for the first time ever. Maybe your usual work environment is busy, lots of meetings, social events, and with that temporary on hold, it can seriously have its impact. And finally, I thought this would be interesting to share. I do read a lot at the moment about cabin fever and people trying to break free from home. However, this chart paints a bit of a different picture. There's such a high percentage of people who indicated that working from home compared to co-working space and cafes, for example, really was their preference. So let's not always buy into the hype. It does seem that people often do feel comfortable based on this study working in this way. Now, again, obviously this was, pre-COVID-19, and we do know that the further restrictions have definitely provided additional challenges, but it's still food for thought, particularly if you're going to continue these working arrangements post-COVID-19. So let's summarize this first section of our presentation. Once again, whether it's the pandemic or not, remote working is definitely on the rise. And there are many benefits for us as business leaders in offering this. Once again, whether it's a pandemic or not, we really do need to look at these benefits for the businesses and benefits for employees. You can see them listed there on the left and the right-hand side of the screen. Remember, just 3 weeks ago, the economy was doing so well, and it's my belief it will bounce back relatively quickly. When times are good, talented people have choices. So by being able to offer flexible working, particularly if that's what they've been accustomed to in the past, really will help us compete with the rest of other organizations who are trying to attract and keep these talented employees. Again, it isn't for everyone, but for a significant number of people, it can increase the productivity and it can help us in reducing costs. We also know, just to choose the bottom on the left-hand side, in helping the environment, again, the traffic through LA and the surrounding areas, definitely can be a challenge. And referring back to the SCV EDC mission in living and working in the Valley, this definitely has these obvious environmental benefits too. Regarding employees, I think we mentioned these, but one final comment: in the times we're in, people really are looking for great leaders, less micromanagement. Yes, we first do have to keep them closer at the start to build that trust between us and really verify employees before we open the gates and send them home. But if we can build high trust relationships and give them breathing space, then we really can release this talent. And what technology is allowing us to do is provide a leveler. We aren't competing between those in cubes compared to those in corner offices or glass boardrooms. We're all now really squares on a screen. Again, I won't repeat all the considerations, but it's important to say again that it isn't for everyone. And one quick headline here for me is in relation to technology. Referring back to perceptions, we can sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that in 2020, people are comfortable using technology. There's certainly a misconception, in my opinion, that millennials and Gen Z prefer technology. They've been brought up in it, they're fine with it, they can get on with it. Just not the case. From our experience through the years, even in 2020, simple things like software updates, accessing and using collaboration platforms, and even the basics in regards to PowerPoint and firewalls and email management can really be a challenge for some people. So IT literacy is so an area we must not neglect if we're going to continue to offer remote working opportunities. So we spent the first 10-15 minutes or so framing and contextualizing remote working. But I do think it's fair to say, whether you're choosing to offer it or whether it's required just to get through the next few weeks, hopefully it's just the next few weeks, your ultimate aim really must be at a minimum to continue business operations, maintain profitability, and retain key employees while working under this new set of working conditions. And we're now going to focus on these three areas as a way to achieve this. And the first area we're going to spend a few minutes kicking the tires on is really how to enhance communication. Now, these are things we've picked up over the last 14 years working with different clients. This is what we think. However, we'll have time at the end of the webinar for your comments and suggestions. There is a great deal of wisdom on the webinar, and we also want to leverage this too. I won't read through all these with the limited time we have. A lot of these are common sense organized, although we have found that sometimes common sense isn't always commonly practiced. But things like minimizing interruptions when we're communicating virtually really is a no-brainer, or should be. We're understanding the elements of communication, for example, number one on the list, may be something you haven't thought of before and something that is very important when communicating virtually. So whether you're presenting to a large group or a small team virtually, understanding the elements of communication really is key to success. I don't know if you knew, but within communication, a speaker's words, the words I'm sharing today, it's only a small fraction of my efforts. The pitch and tone of my voice and the speed and rhythm of the spoken word and the pauses between those words may actually express more about what is being communicated than the words alone. Furthermore, my gestures and posture and pose and expressions usually convey a variety of subtle signals. These non-verbal elements can present a listener with important clues to the speaker's thoughts and feelings, and thus substantiate or contradict the speaker's words. Now, for those who haven't heard before, in the 70s, Professor Albert Morami actually did a study into the elements of communication. And his research concluded that the words actually make up 7%, the tone of voice make up 38%, and body language actually makes up the most, 55% of personal communication. Therefore, next time you're preparing to deliver a conference call or a session like this, it may be useful to consider how your message will be received if you're unable to use the most effective element of communication, and that's body language. What about sending an email? By doing this, you're losing both the influence of body language and the tone, leaving just 7% impact of the words used. Now, another key aspect that's often missed when it comes to agreeing goals and expectations, we miss this so many times, number 2 and number 3 on the list. Do we actually have that transparency with our employees and agree goals with them and have very clear expectations and guidelines? We can't assume they know what to do, because if we do, we'll be wrong. Think back to your school days. So not to patronize employees, but a little bit like students, sometimes we do need to spell out what our goals of the lesson or project are, or longer term, what are the objectives for the week. And we also need to agree how we're going to work together in this new setting. And we'll share some more best practice on that in just a few moments. One other highlight I wanted to share is number 10, systems. Now, although organizations have been scrambling, what I can, speak definitely from a position of confidence on is it can definitely be system overload, even pre-COVID-19. Just think for a second. Email, HR software, collaboration tools, Microsoft, Apple, PowerPoint or Keynote, different meeting platforms, webinar portals. I could go on. Have you heard the phrase less is more? When it comes to technology, from my experience, having a degree in information systems and work within technology for a number of years, this is most definitely true. This could actually be an opportunity to review the systems you subscribe to and use internally and see if there's things you can lose, combine, or even buy into. And linking this to my earlier comment and outlined here at number 9 is the correct training on these systems. Google Docs is similar to Microsoft, and that is similar to Apple-based products, for example, Pages and Numbers for Mac users on the webinar today, like us at Newleaf. But it's enough variety to ensure people do need pointing towards training to become confident and competent in using them. There's loads of videos online, LinkedIn, Learning, etc., YouTube, you can point people to. Doing great for time. Got about 9 or 10 minutes remaining. So we're going to transition to another key consideration in the current climate, which is delivering training like we're doing today and facilitating meetings. When have we ever spent so much time on these types of platforms before? So we need to make sure we're doing it right. Again, with the time available, we haven't got time to dissect each of these best practices. But if you do notice something we gloss over here and have a question relating to it, either stick around at the end and ask. We'll be on the webinar when the webinar finishes, or please do follow up after the session. But let's just highlight one or two key areas. In fact, with the time we have, let's tie a few together. And if you look at number 2, 4, 5, and 6, these 4 points are really relating to the instructional design of virtual training and meeting facilitation. Too often, we can jump on Zoom and deliver off the hip. We can talk at people for 60 minutes with little or no engagement. How do we know? Well, because we've experienced this ourselves, and we've partnered with many hundreds of organizations to address these issues. Also, whether it's virtual training or a meeting or an in-person one, it's often the same outcome. It can be last minute, it can be poorly planned, people without clear expectations of why they are there and what the session is trying to achieve. Webcam or no webcam, that still exists in 2020. Again, let's use this strange time to our advantage and get the basics right when it comes to remote workers. Let's position ourselves to knock it out of the park for them. Let's plan, get organized, send the agenda out before the meeting, plan for an engaging icebreaker to get everyone involved. Even if it's a long-standing team, make it fun for a few minutes, or asking, a different employee, somebody different, to plan something different so the rest of the group have a chance to hear from someone else. Include polls, genuine engaging opportunities such as virtual brainstorming and energizing activities if the training session is going to go long. If you can, use breakout rooms to group people in smaller groups and keep the session fresh, and to mix it up who is working with who. And in relation to number 3 on the list, let's stop thinking in 60-minute segments. Can we do this in 15 minutes? And does everyone really have to be there? Once again, our virtual employees looking to us as business leaders to be the first one on the call, the first one there organized, having a clear plan for our time together and high expectations, which leads us to number 10 on the list. Have you worked with your team yet to agree a set of expectations or rules for engagement for these meetings and trainings that are taking place online? So if we switch to the next slide, you'll actually see here a list of top 10 example rules of engagement. We'll leave that on the screen just for a few seconds. Again, if you want to copy the slides afterwards, maybe this is your starting point. Again, this really is probably common sense for lots of people on the webinar, but again, common sense isn't always commonly practiced, particularly under the current working environment, which I'm sure we'd all agree has been stressful for most business owners and senior leaders. We can see a top 10 list there, which you may choose to pass on to your team or work with your team to agree them, so it doesn't look as if it's being put on them, but they've been part of the process. And by doing that, hopefully the meeting structure and the way the meetings flow will be a lot more efficient. We're now going to move towards some of the platforms and tools you can use. And yes, we can't ignore Zoom, it's been everywhere. The share price rocketed last week, but then some recent privacy issues have affected that in some way. We do use Zoom with our clients and internally, and to be fair, they have addressed a lot of these issues this past week, and we've been really impressed with this platform. Free version is great, but for a small monthly price, you'd have more people attend the meetings and have longer sessions, but there's so many more options. Take a look at this slide. We've organized these into 3 key areas. Again, with the time we have, we're not going to talk through all these now, But if anything jumps off the page, maybe you've heard of Mockstra for a collaboration platform, or Slack. Maybe when it comes to virtual classroom delivery, you haven't used GoToWebinar that we're using today, and you think, oh, that could be one to check out. There's definitely benefits with GoToWebinar, which aren't available with Zoom, for example, but then the costs are different, and that's reflected in the price. Adobe Connect is another platform we use a lot. But depending on budget, free conference call for webinars and virtual classrooms, and even FaceTime can be just as effective. In the bottom right, you can see the self-paced e-learning packages there. Some of the big players, there's over 400 in the marketplace now. But in creating self-paced e-learning opportunities for your employees, things like Lectora, Gomo, Adobe Captivate, Articulate, are some of the big players. And you can actually see on the next slide some of the projects we have created at Newleaf Training and Development using some of those packages. We've used them for soft skill development, mandatory training, and more, all designed using the organization's branding and hosted on an LMS that employees have access to on demand, any time of day, any device, whatever time zone. Pretty cool examples. And to check out more on our website, go to the online page and you'll be able to get a deeper dive on each of those projects. And finally, for the last 3 or 4 minutes, our ultimate aim throughout all this is to raise engagement. We need to make sure that when COVID-19 clears, we still have a group where possible. Again, I do understand each organization has their own challenges in doing this, but as best we can, a group of engaged employees ready to restart. So what can we be doing now, today, virtually, to ensure they're as engaged as they can be? Again, like before, we don't have time to go through each of these points one by one, but please do reach out if I gloss over something you notice, you want to have a follow-up conversation on, or a deeper dive, an extra explanation. But some of the headlines I would share, number one, providing structure. Really, truly take this opportunity to build a virtual sense of community. Check in every day. Ask them, how they like to communicate. Do they want virtual face-to-face, or is a regular text enough? Not your preference, theirs. In relation to number three, it's our responsibility to teach our employees how to work from home. Again, it doesn't always come naturally. Where to work, how to schedule breaks, where to eat lunch, how to avoid that feeling of guilt, as I mentioned earlier. I certainly wish Stuart, my manager I mentioned at Randstad, had done this for me. Now, although camera on, as you can see for number 7, isn't for everybody, where we can, it's really effective in engaging with each other. Now, do you remember what I said earlier in regards to elements of communication, words, tone, body language? Now, we do communicate best when we engage best, and we influence best when those 3 areas are working in sync. And stripping back body language, for example, with a camera off, and effective, to be able to influence people that way really can be detrimental. And finally, number 8 and number 10, times are tough, and depending on your circumstances, this is more difficult for some than others. But try as best we can. As leaders, we have to go first and try and be generous. Could be as simple as a text message on a Friday afternoon to give someone a great end to the week in uncertain times, just a few encouraging words. Or it could be an e-gift card as a surprise for great work. Small gestures, but honestly not forgotten. And in relation to number 10, pandemic or not, virtual or not, great times are the most challenging of times. Great leaders do what they say they're going to do. It's easy to cancel a meeting, for example, particularly if our preference is that we don't like virtual meetings. It's easy to knock it off the calendar. But going back to the earlier messages we've shared, particularly in terms of some of the drawbacks to remote working, it can cause isolation, particularly at a time when it's hard to leave the house anyway. So it's our job to go the extra mile, be consistent, and do what you say you're going to do when you're going to do it. This does help massively when keeping an engaged workforce. And with that, as a very brief summary, this is what we've spent the last 35 minutes or so covering on. Hopefully, it's encouraged you to consider the concept of remote working differently from how you maybe first perceived it. And yes, short term, it's allowing us to work through this very, very difficult time. but longer term, it can bring enormous benefits to their organizations. And hopefully, some of the skills or the targeted questions we've asked today will encourage you to continue this way of working post COVID-19. So we do have some time now, I think, if there's any questions been coming through. I haven't been able to see those on the screen, but I think we've got some time to take some of those.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Mark. We'll begin with the question and answer session now. Again, if anybody does have any questions, please use the question feature on the right of the control panel, and we'll do our best to get your question asked. Mark, first we have is, what's the first thing that leaders and individual managers can do to help their employees get ready for remote working?
I think there's so many answers to that, but my number one would be referring back to the slides. It's very clear expectations, and it's teaching people as far as the way to work. Those two key phrases, expectations and how, how people do it. Again, we can assume sometimes that it comes naturally, that we just sit at the kitchen table, the breakfast bar, maybe we sit in the lounge on the sofa and we have the laptop on our knee. But that's a long day to be doing that. We need to structure our day. We need to make sure that our mindset is right. Something I've been doing for the last few weeks is trying to carry Monday to Friday on as normal as best I can, as far as my exercise regime, breakfast, when I would usually break, when I would answer emails. But for some people, it's very hard to do that when they have distractions with animals and walking dogs and children working from home on different projects. Maybe the partner is working from home as well. So again, it may seem common sense to us. It's just something we would do naturally, but I can assure you honestly, 100%, it does not come naturally to everybody. So maybe that slide I shared as far as those rules of engagement of how we have these virtual meetings, but also some best practice in relation to how people work from home. Don't assume people know that. I would definitely share that with them.
Perfect. This next question, I guess, could kind of be answered with the last slide you had, but if you had to pick something on there, what are a few things that leaders can do to create a good remote culture?
I think number one is to define it. With any organization, with any home, we have to define what a culture is. So I think we need to agree what that culture is, and hopefully, if we've got the right culture at work, then that will transcend itself to whether somebody's working in the office or somebody's working in the pajamas in their back bedroom, because those expectations, those values, which, every organization is built on, how we achieve these great things together, hopefully they have been agreed already, and it's not something that people forget when they walk out of the office door. So my best advice in relation to that would be, can you define your culture, and can your employees define your culture? And just a very quick story. I actually presented at the HR Florida conference last year, a room full of 145 approximately HR professionals. And one of my questions was, how many people in the room can define their vision, mission, and values? And there was just one lady at the front who went into her purse, got her business card out. On the back of the business card, the organization had actually printed the vision, mission, and values, so she could actually read it back to me. But in all seriousness, nobody could in the room. It's nearly 145 people. So if we can't define what it is, and our employees can't define what it is and what that culture looks and feels like, then it's very hard for them to replicate that in any other environment. So two quick things to finish. Number one, this could be an opportunity for you and your organizations to think about, what is your vision, mission, and values? What is your culture? And do your employees know what that culture is? And then how do we transcend that then to virtual? And again, any further questions on that and how to do that, I'm more than happy to follow up after the webinar.
Thank you, Mark. What do you think about the security concerns that have been raised about Zoom? And for those who aren't aware, can you quickly just give a touch on what those security issues are?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it firsthand with, within Florida, within Seminole County where I live. I've got a 13-year-old daughter I mentioned before, and a lot of the educators are using a bit of a hybrid between Google Classroom and Zoom. And there's been several instances where people have been, I'll use the term breaking in to meetings, either from to derail a meeting in some way by sharing some inappropriate content, let's say, in front of children, which obviously hasn't gone down well from anyone's perspective, parents, children, or educators alike. And the second thing is, obviously, they've been going into some very high profile meetings outside of education when this crisis has been taking place. I don't know the specific organizations, but I'm led to believe some very well-known organizations have been using Zoom to talk about share price and how they're going to have to pivot the business, furloughing staff, etc. And people have been going into these meetings and listening to all this confidential information, and obviously, in some cases, using that against them, let's say. So that's what's been happening as far as the misuse of Zoom. One thing I've noticed when I upgraded my Zoom account, or our Newleaf Zoom account, I think it was the start of this week or the very end of last week. One thing they've now introduced is when somebody used to come into Zoom. So if I started a meeting and I wanted Paul, for example, over on the West Coast to come into the meeting, Paul would automatically just come into the meeting. What I noticed on the upgrade when I did it earlier this week or the end of last week is it now places them into a waiting room. So we actually have to invite people into the room. Now, there is a way to disable that, but that's now a default. Whereas before, people were just coming in, as and when they wanted, really. So they've definitely put several things in place in order to be able to address that. And what you'll see now, one last comment, is at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice a privacy option, which wasn't there previously. And you can actually lock people into the room when everybody's in and limit who can share files. So they've reacted very positively, and as a result of that, hopefully that's been addressed.
Perfect. Mark, these next two questions, I'll kind of combine them together. And it's, what advice do you have for people in client-facing functions? And with that, how would you facilitate a highly complex or emotionally charged conversation when people aren't face-to-face?
Okay, just repeat that first part of the question for me, please.
Sure. What advice do you have for people in client-facing functions now that they've moved to remote working?
Okay, I guess I would need a little bit of further context as far as what that particular role would be, because it was obviously changed depending on the products and services that are being offered. But what I would say is when it comes to working with clients, so, again, these are things which we may think are common sense, but again, common sense isn't always commonly practiced. We did some work recently with an organization, a very large, global, well-known transportation organization up in Jacksonville here in Florida. And we actually worked with their sales professionals who were moving they'd increased the target as far as working with clients and potential clients from around 8% last year to they had a target of 40% for 2020. And I'm sure that will go much higher now based on what's happened in relation to selling virtually. So we work with them in trying to organize a company-wide policy in relation to best practice when it comes to those very things. How do we work with clients and potential clients? And what I would say is, I think first and foremost, people can sometimes get a little bit hung up about being behind the webcam. At the end of the day, it's just like being in somebody's office, and it doesn't feel that way because it does feel different. But the more experience you get and the more we get the opportunity to try these things, the more comfortable it is for people. 100% I can guarantee that. And then outside of that, although we're not using the webcam today, we do a lot, and I mean a lot, of webinars with clients and for clients, and obviously for business development meetings, etc. And it's the simple things that, again, we take for granted, but people don't do. Things like the background. I kid you not, I had a sales call with a client yesterday, and the client had just worked out how to use the green screen function in Zoom, for those who've used that function. And it actually positioned himself in the Starship Enterprise. as a background. Now, make of that what you will, but we have to think about the professionalism of how we're presenting ourselves in these uncertain times. So a nice professional background, a nice professional microphone, things like not having a dog barking in the background, all things you think, well, yeah, of course people know that. They really truly don't. And that comes back to that, those rules of engagement. Do we have something organization wide for particularly in client facing roles as far as best practice, a top 5, a top 10 of things we should be considering when working with clients? That's the first part of your question. What was the second part of the question?
How would you facilitate a highly complex or emotionally charged conversation when people aren't face to face?
Yeah, I think, again, that's probably another webinar in itself, but my headline would be, referring back to the content we've covered today, is please don't forget Morabian's theory of communication and the elements of communication and those 3 aspects. Whether there's a pandemic or not, whether, again, times are good, indifferent or whatever, people do tend to want to avoid conflict, and they will usually address conflict in an email or a text message. And that's definitely not best practice for lots of reasons. One too many exclamation marks, a period in the wrong place, part of the sentence that's accidentally in caps lock and we didn't mean it to be, can change the whole context of that message and can really be like a red rag to a bull. So think about it, that's only 7% the words we use, either the spoken words or whether it's a text message or an email. Now, the very least we should be doing is layering on top, like today, the tone, the intonation, how we're saying things to people, so people can read the emotion, particularly in highly emotional conversations. But I really would, as best we can, to go back to what I mentioned before, people get hung up because we're behind a computer screen, but by just clicking the webcam and being able to see each other allows that other 55% of the communication. It adds to that conversation, in that we can see somebody in the mannerisms and the body language and how they're conveying the message. So that's a very brief overview. If anybody's got any follow-up questions with that, again, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation after the webinar.
Great, thank you. Mark, are you seeing different organizations are better at embracing virtual technology than others?
Yeah, 100%. Again, it comes back to culture. And I think there's a lot of business owners, even in very large organizations, or members of the senior team, going back to our perception, behavior, results model that we shared at the start. They have their own head in the sand at times and their own perceptions that, technology is not as effective, or we've tried this before. We did, is this what we're calling it now? Oh, we did this 5 years ago and it was a disaster. Therefore, let's just keep doing what we've done before because it's got us to this point. So my own personal view is that we do need to challenge those perceptions as best we can, have very diverse leadership teams, different ages, different ethnicities, cultures, races, gender, all those different things, and bring this diversity to a senior team to offer those different insights and opinions. And, it is unfortunate if this situation has backed organizations into a corner to really in 2020 be having to Google, how do we communicate virtually? Because all they'll follow is the top result on Google, which may be Zoom. And not to talk down Zoom, not to promote Zoom. We use it, as I mentioned before, but there's many other platforms that we use as well, Adobe Connect and GoToWebinar. They all offer different things. So to be clear, yes, we're seeing very different uses of technology. And I think if this experience has done nothing else for organizations, it will hopefully allow them to see the benefits of using it. Because although it isn't the answer to everything, it will have forced organizations to certainly consider it, try it, and learn from it.
Mark, I'll leave you with this final question, and then once you answer it, I'll let you go into your closing. Do you see this crisis changing the way all teams and organizations operate going forward?
100% yes is a very definitive answer. Again, people go a bit over the top depending what they're trying to sell. If it's on LinkedIn, people go overboard, or a Twitter or an online blog or something. It's not all going to go online. I'll give you one very quick example. Somebody mentioned conflict before. one of the in-person programs we deliver is called Positively Reducing Conflict, which is a half-day seminar. And, can that be done online? Absolutely. Do we offer that as a webinar? Absolutely. To be completely transparent, is it as effective online as it is in person? Probably not, because that's a very emotional topic that really lends itself to having people in a room. It can be done virtually and it can be effective, but the role play and the sensitivity of that subject definitely lends itself more to in person. So I think what it's done is it allowed organizations to see the benefits of online, whether it's training, facilitating, meeting. Some organizations will be thinking, why didn't we do this 10 years ago? Because it's been seamless. But I think what people should do is, again, I think I mentioned this at the very start, my introduction, is take the very best of what's happening now, blend that with what they were doing previously, and use that to knit it together for what they want to be doing over the next 3 to 5 years.
Thank you. Mark, I'll just let you go ahead and do your final closing now.
Thank you so much. So just wanted to remind you of my contact details that are on there. I'm going to leave that on for 10 seconds. That is our website, newleaftd.com. That is my email address. Please do reach out after the webinar with any questions. I always love to connect with like-minded people, even if we can't be of service, just to build our connections and continue the conversation. So you can find me on LinkedIn if you search for Mark Griffiths Training or Mark Griffiths Newleaf. Connect on Twitter. That is our East Coast office number there. As we mentioned before, we do have an office there, literally in your back garden in Santa Clarita. So you can obviously follow with Paul as well. But I would love to connect with you for sure. And just as a final reminder, if we can be of service during these challenging times in relation to training and development, or maybe the strategy in going virtual and you maybe still scrambling, and you're wanting to do this digitally, and you're wanting to be effective, and you're wanting for your employees to be engaged, but maybe for whatever reason you've just not got the time or the experience in doing so, then we would very much like to be of service. As a reminder, we do deliver professional development online as well. So if there's any ongoing training needs, then we can obviously deliver those online to your virtual workforce. And we do create those self-paced e-learning modules, and we can support in the development and delivery of live webinars. So I just want to finish by thanking you all for attending. Do hope you found it useful. I've really enjoyed spending the time with you, and do have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you again, Mark, with Newleaf Development.